Look, internet regulation is a solution running around looking for a problem. There is no problem. No sphere of industry in the history of the planet has grown more in 5 years than the internet has in the last 5. We don't need internet regulation. In fact, it's grown precisely because we don't have any internet regulation. You'll notice he chose as some of his examples of who they're not going to regulate. Amazon, eBay, they're not regulating those. They're regulating the providers of internet service to the benefit of Amazon and eBay so that they don't have to pay for the bandwidth they're using, and that price gets passed on to the precious consumer that Art Brodsky and Public Knowledge pretend to want to defend.
Okay.
I've always been
hang on a second. I don't want any personal aspersions here. This is a civil discussion.
So that wasn't a personal aspersion. That wasn't a personal. Look, I always found it amazing that the telecom companies who spend hundreds of billions of dollars to build out the internet and the infrastructure are anti-consumer, but the public interest groups who haven't spent a dime are somehow looking out for the consumer's interest. That always staggers me.
Well, now, how do you respond to the statement that Art made that without the FCC, and this I find interesting, without the FCC, if there are problems, if there are difficulties, there's no way to get them handled.
No, if there's a bad trade practice, it goes to the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC. What they're doing here, and to say that they're not regulating the internet with this monster power grab on December 21st is really ridiculous. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been this years-long struggle against it. This is a huge new swath of regulation and the government inserting itself into the private sector. Right now, on the books, without any of this unauthorized power grab by the internet, by the FCC, because the FCC cannot do anything unless and until Congress writes a law that says, hey, FCC, do this. And the chairman of the FCC, Julius Shinikowski, 2 months ago to the Washington Post admitted we're dealing with a Communications Act that does not address broadband. So what he did on December 21st was totally unauthorized and will be dumped in court, just like it was the last time they tried it. But right now, on the books, there are consumer protections, laws that exist, and if something happens, it goes to the Federal Trade Commission, and it's dealt with. There's no need for the FCC to insert itself here. This is just, I think, further evidence that the FCC is an entity that probably has served its purpose and needs to go away.
Art, I want to go back to you for a second on this. Seton just said that if there are problems in the current situation, they get regulated and they get oversight from the FTC. Does that not address the concerns that you have in the current situation?
It does not, for a couple of reasons. First of all, Congress has already spoken on the need to regulate telecommunications companies. It's called the Communications Act. Now,
but it doesn't address broadband, Art. The chairman admits it.
May I please?
Yeah, please go ahead, Art.
Thank you. And I'll get to your objection in a moment, Seton. First of all, the Communications Act governs largely the behavior of telephone companies. There is a cutout in that the Federal Trade Commission does not have jurisdiction over the services they provide. The Federal Trade Commission has jurisdiction over advertising and trade practices, but not over network services. That is strictly related to the Federal Communications Commission. Further, the Federal Trade Commission has no overall rulemaking authority, even if it did have some jurisdiction. So you have an agency that was set up to deal exactly with these situations. Now, what the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission was talking about is a very technical matter of communications law. And that was, and I don't know, Brent, how much you want to get into the weeds here and stop me if I'm digging too deep, but the reason we are in this situation we find ourselves goes back to that sort of regulatory shuffle that I mentioned to you from 5 years ago, when the Bush-era Federal Communications Commission took these advanced services out of the traditional part of the Communications Act, which protected consumers, and put it into a part that's sort of a gray netherworld, where you sort of on a case-by-cases figure out what's going on. Now, to skip some of the detail, what happened last year is that an appeals court in Washington said the way the FCC wanted to enforce its policy over broadband, which is now most of the connections between us and the Internet, was not the correct way of doing it. It did not say that the FCC has no jurisdiction over the Internet. It was specifically referencing the technical legal argument dealing with how the Commission defended its actions. So what the reason that this power grab that was referred to is not a power grab at all. In fact, there's precedent for it. The FCC has done this before. It did it in 2006, as a matter of fact, when AT&T, in the midst of reconstituting itself, bought Bell South. And one of the merger conditions, and I can read that if you wish, is that it operate the network in a neutral manner. So this is perfectly acceptable telecommunications law, and it is certainly not revolutionary in any sense of the word.
Okay, let me go off on a little bit of a tangent here. I want to go to Michael. Michael,
yes.
As a user, okay, now these two gentlemen, by their very positions, have a certain vested interest in and I'm not in any way challenging either one of your credibility. It's just you naturally, you represent this company, or organization, you represent that organization. But Michael, you represent no organization here. You're very much an independent mind. As a user, you've been a user when the FCC was in control to a certain degree of the Internet, and you've been a user during the time that has not been the case. Have you found any kind of differences either in how you use the Internet or in your experiences with any kind of problems or anything at all that would differentiate those two periods?
Nothing I could really put my fingers on. I haven't seen anything except the rates go up continuously, but that's true for everything in our lives, unfortunately. But I didn't see any benefit from FCC control. The telephone company is on their list because it was a baby and they were there, and that's the way life goes. But that's, between one part of one state and say part of or a different part of another state, within and between states and all that. The Internet's a somewhat different animal in that we're talking about the ability for a human being on one point on the planet to contact another human being directly, independently, and somewhat anonymously, another human being somewhere else on the planet. I don't see where the FCC is going to help. And to be honest with you, I don't trust them.
Okay, and by the way, just so you all know, folks,
it's a whole idea.
A perfect example of what Michael is saying is that Michael right now is in Southern California?
Currently.
Southern California. And Art, let's see, Art, are you over in Washington?
I am.
And Seton, I think, is over in Texas, or is it Virginia?
No, I'm actually in Old Town Alexandria.
Alexandria, Virginia. I am in New Zealand. I'm speaking to you from near the South Pole, and our studios are in Idaho. And so, indeed, we could not do what we're doing without having the Internet functioning the way it is. So
God bless capitalism.
Absolutely. So, Seton, okay, we only have a few minutes before the top of the hour break, but I'm curious that Art seems to, Art has indicated that the authority of the Federal Trade Commission to handle disputes is restricted to the type of disputes and to the nature of the relationship between the disputing parties, that if it has to do with the services per se, it's not an FTC issue. Doesn't that again raise the issue of who's going to arbitrate any problems that we have within the services we receive?
He's not correct. Commissioner McDowell, Robert McDowell, the FCC, specifically in his declination to vote, he voted no on December 21st, and in his dissent comment, he specifically cited the FTC and laws on the books as existing ways to deal with the complaints which Mr. Brodsky raised. I want to go beyond something, and Mike made this point to a degree, and I would agree with him wholeheartedly. I'm now going to name 3 governments that are interfering with their country's use of the Internet: China, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. I would now like to ask Art Brodsky, please, right now, to name 3 current net neutrality violations being committed by private companies in the United States.
Now, hang on. Rather than turn it into a debate of that sort, what I would like to ask you, Art, is what about concerns that if a government takes control or exerts control or has authority to exert control over Internet usage or content, what about the concerns as to how that can be abused?
Well, if that were happening, I'd be up there on the barricades with you all. But that's not what's happening.
But they don't have authority.
But for example, we have that happening in certain countries. Are you not concerned
we do.
that
Absolutely.
could develop? Are you not concerned that this can be a step toward the development of a similar reality in our country?
Well, I mean, each of those countries has its own governments and its own laws. I mean, we're certainly not governed the way Iran or China or North Korea are. We have to do what we do within our own legal structures.
No, we don't, because the chairman of the FCC just acted outside the legal structures.
Well, I think there's some dispute about that.
Not amongst 302 members of the last Democrat-controlled Congress. Not with the D.C. Circuit Court.
Several years ago, I conducted an investigation in which I learned that every single server in the world, save maybe 2, I found one in Canada and another in New Zealand, routes through U.S. servers. Every server, anywhere, it doesn't matter what country it's in, it routes through the U.S. So my question for you, Michael, to what extent does this currently provide the U.S. government the technical ability to filter, regulate, or otherwise control the content of the Internet, should it desire to do so? And how would regulation of the Internet change that, or would it? And so the very fact that servers route through the U.S., what does that give to the U.S. government in terms of controls?
Well, if you imagine the Internet, Brent, as a set of highways, which is one of the analogies that some people use, and if every highway on the planet routed through U.S., then any U.S.-based police officer could tag one, pull it over, get it off the highway, regulate how it travels, where it travels, when it travels, what color it has to be, how fast it can go. Any kind of control or regulation that they may dream up becomes possible if it's routed through a server on what they consider their territory, simply because they have the tools and expertise to do it. I mean, anything that goes across, for lack of a better term, across their desk, becomes regulatable. It's just a matter of doing their best to keep their hands off of it. Stopping them from regulating is much, much harder than actually doing it.
So what you're saying is, though, that the technical infrastructure for controls already exists.
Oh, no problem at all. If it goes through a computer, it can be controlled. They have systems already in place that monitor for, I don't remember what the current list is. The last list I heard was 7,000 words in different languages. And if any of those words appears in text or spoken in the communication systems that they have running through their monitoring equipment, which is anything that touches the soil, they can flag it, find out where it's coming from and where it went to, and it's on what they call a rotating record system, which means they can go back to the beginning of the conversation and find out what was said by everybody from the beginning of the call, even if that word shows up near the end of the call. So yes, technically it's not a problem. It's just a matter of are they, I guess what I'm trying to say is if they decide to and no one stops them, it's not an issue.